Hi there, I'm Hallie, and we are coming on the air with continuing coverage of that breaking news. Any second now, Donald Trump set to head back to New Jersey after what you've been watching. A moment that is historic in this country. The first time ever that a former president of the United States has been arraigned on charges he tried to disrupt the transfer of power, tried to overthrow the legitimate 2020 election. We have just seen former President Trump plead not guilty in a nearly 30-minute hearing after saying he's a victim of a political persecution. Here's what we know about this day in Washington. Donald Trump is facing 4 charges in this case related to the so-called fake elector scheme that basically tried to throw out the votes in 7 states legitimately won by President Biden. These are charges that could carry decades of prison time. Again, Mr. Trump is pleading not guilty. That is what we have learned in just the last 25 minutes or so. As you are taking a look now at the plane, former President Trump set to leave Washington minutes after that arraignment and head back to New Jersey. The indictment from Special Counsel Jack Smith, who was in the room today, is unlike anything we've seen. There is a lot of evidence here, including in-the-moment notes from Mr. Trump's former number 2, former Vice President Mike Pence, about the pressure he faced to carry out the president's wish at the time to stay in power, Donald Trump. There's emails from the Justice Department, a ton of fake elector ballots, and there's a lot of testimony from Mr. Pence, from top officials at the Justice Department. And by that, we mean contemporaneous notes, for example, from former Vice President Pence. There's information from state elections officials who talk about this scheme, and this is only what we know about. There could be a lot more. It is the 3rd time in the last 4 months the former president has had his fingerprints taken, has gone into a courtroom. Remember, he faces charges in New York for alleged hush money payments. He faces a separate federal case on classified documents he's accused of improperly taking to Mar-a-Lago. There's also a 4th case in Georgia, too, where he may be charged. We could hear about that any day now. But remember, this is more than just a legal story, as you heard the former president himself allude to in just the last couple of minutes. He wants to win back the White House for another 4 years. He is literally raising money for his 2024 campaign today, asking his supporters to show the world that Americans stand with him by donating money. Let me play for you what we just heard from him a couple of moments ago on the tarmac at Reagan National Airport in Washington. Watch.
This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it. When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America.
We've got our team covering all of it from every angle now as part of our continuing coverage here on NBC News Now. Garrett Hake and Tom Winter are outside the courthouse in Washington. We've got Chuck Todd and Mark Murray for the political breakdown, and we'll have our NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos with us as well. Garrett, you were inside. An extraordinary moment, an extraordinary scene, different from the ones that came before and yet reminiscent of the other indictments as well. We know the former president is on his way back to Bedminster, and he's set to hit the campaign trail in just a matter of days.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And I think we're going to see him use this experience to fuel his campaign, as he's done so much to this point. He has tried to take every political or legal obstacle and turn it into a political opportunity, and this will be no different. Look, I've been in the courtroom for every one of these arraignments, and Donald Trump is getting far more comfortable in this environment. I mean, I've been struck by the fact that this is someone, both as a businessman and a billionaire before he got into politics and then as president of the United States, who's not used to operating on somebody else's timeline and it's somebody else's control. And that's the case when he's in federal or local criminal custody, as he's been in these arraignments. He was forced to sit and wait in the courtroom today for about 15 minutes until the judge came in. You could tell he was visibly frustrated and annoyed by it. But beyond that, he was comfortable. He was joking with his attorneys. He's gotten used to living in this space and to trying to turn it the minute he's out to his advantage, not even waiting to get back to Bedminster to make comments like he did in Miami before he made substantive comments on that arraignment. The other thing that I couldn't help but notice being in the room for both of these arraignments, Hallie, is the way that Jack Smith is trying to make this feel like a home game for the Justice Department. He stared down Donald Trump when Trump was at the defense table. He made a point to stay in the room afterwards in full view of the reporters who were there, kind of shaking hands, clapping backs, smiling and encouraging even the junior members of the prosecution team. I think it's very clear the special counsel and his office understand what they're in for. And it's just fascinating to watch the interpersonal dynamics between Trump and Smith, who, Trump went to great lengths to avoid making any kind of eye contact with throughout the duration of that hearing.
Let me go to Tom Winter now, who is joining you there in Washington, about what happens next in this case. We know that the next court appearance for the judge that will actually be overseeing this case and this trial is going to happen on August 28th. That is, of course, 5 days after the first Republican primary debate. We don't expect Donald Trump to participate. It's still an open question. Do we expect the judge in this instance, Judge Chutkan, to set a trial date at that hearing?
Right. So that's actually the next step when it comes to the paperwork here in this case, Hallie. And so what's going to be decided? First, prosecutors within the next 7 days have to file a notice with the judge indicating when they want the trial date to be. At that point, Trump's attorneys will have an opportunity to respond. So those arguments will be before the judge. They can weigh the reasons as to why the trial, presumably from the special counsel's perspective, should move forward quickly, and presumably based on what the defense has telegraphed, including in an interview with our own Savannah Guthrie, they want to take as much time as possible, in their words, to review the evidence. Prosecutors called the discovery in this case substantial. That's not a surprise. We saw the volume of evidence that was entered into the record in the January 6th investigation. Granted, a huge portion of that pertains to the people that broke into the Capitol. That's not going to necessarily be included because that's not in the charges here. But obviously, we know from the indictment, and we can extrapolate from the indictment, that they've spoken with the former Vice President of the United States. It appears that they have information from the former Attorney General, top Justice Department officials, and they have interviews and information from people all over the country that were involved in some of these, as they call it, kind of fake elector schemes. So there's a number of things that will be turned over. Those interview reports will be turned over. Those names will be turned over. Emails, messages, including, as you keyed in on when we first started here today, the idea of the former vice president's notes, contemporaneous notes that were taken. That's included in the indictment as well. All of that will be sent to the former president's legal team. And then from there, they'll obviously have to go through it. But it's that discussion in the volume of evidence that will likely guide the judge in this case as to when this trial could be. A number of factors that they'll consider here. And all of that is pending on a protective order. What the former president and his legal team can do with that information, what they can put out. And I expect that might be actually a bit of a sticking point here. Folks have keyed in on a couple other arguments, or a couple other statements, rather, that were raised in court. This idea of not tampering with jurors. That's something that I've heard as part of kind of a standard admonishment from the judges, rather, in prior cases. It shouldn't be construed that the president can't talk about this case. If prosecutors didn't want him to speak about the facts of this case, that's something separate that they have to apply to the judge for, type of a gag order, if you will. That would be something that would be applied for further down the line with some sort of evidence as to what the president was doing, not contacting witnesses. That's something else that the former president will have to keep an eye on. I know it's a debate that came up earlier today as far as, well, if they're talking about January 6th, say on a debate stage between Pence and Trump, it's something that could come up. Obviously, the vice president, former vice president, is a witness to it. But that's something that's talked about in the open, Hallie. I think it's the type of discussions that occur behind the scenes. That's typically the types of things that the judge is looking out for and that prosecutors are looking out for, so that it'd be one thing if you and I were debating and you were a witness against me in a criminal case. We could have that discussion. It's out in the open. But if I tried to pressure you in private afterwards, that would be a potential problem. And I think that's what the judge was really keying in on there. So a number of things to keep an eye on this case. Bottom line is, within the next 7 days, we'll know when prosecutors want to move forward. And then by the end of the month, I think we'll have a pretty good idea as to when this case might go to trial. And as you well know, Hallie, those dates always change.
That is for sure. Well, Chuck, Tom is addressing something that you raised as we are taking a live look now at the former president's plane getting ready to depart Washington and head back to New Jersey. And, Chuck, that is this issue of the way that Donald Trump will engage with this issue, because we know that he will publicly. He already has been doing it. He delivered that statement on the tarmac. Yes, Chuck Todd, you, friend.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We got Chuck Rosenberg, and I've been, we've got the two Chucks.
I hear you, man. I got you. I'm coming to you, Chuck Todd, on this issue of, key takeaways from what we've seen over the course of the last, 90 minutes or so. And I just want to sort of take a step back here, because we're in it. We've been in rolling coverage now, right, for something like 2 hours, because this is an extraordinary and historic moment in this country. And the reason for that is you have somebody who used to lead this country, accused of disrupting the transfer of power, and who is seeking to lead this country again, not just as a long-shot candidate, but as the very clear frontrunner to take on President Biden.
Look, I keep coming back to, and I mentioned this earlier before our special coverage started, and I'll just share a feeling that I had when I was reading the indictment, is that I got a real pit in my stomach, because you do realize the weight, not just of the indictment, but of now this election, and how the election is going to be the jury, right? The American public is the jury on this. I know that isn't how it's technically going to work, but essentially the American public's going to be deciding whether he should be held account or not. And some might argue that's look, this should have been handled. Our founders created the impeachment process to handle these political questions. And unfortunately, Mitch McConnell chose the exact opposite mindset on here. And I would imagine, I don't know this, I don't want to get into his head, but when you start to see the risk we have now put the democracy in, when the elected Republican leadership of Congress decided not to handle this problem, to punt it, to say, no, let the criminal justice system handle this. No one is above the law. Well, they then have put the rule of law on the ballot. And that's what's so scary. That's what the pit in my stomach is about, because if the country chooses, if this is, which way they choose, he is going to, the projection. He will weaponize the Justice Department. He will weaponize law enforcement. And we're going to live in a very different country. So, and I look back like, how could we have prevented this moment? And I don't look preventing this moment as, oh, justice shouldn't have done this because of the risk. No, I hold the folks in the elected Republican leadership who knew better. And they decided to acquit him on a technicality. Remember this, Hallie. Mitch McConnell essentially had a technicality. Well, he's not in office, so I don't know if this is the proper venue.
Remind people, the technicality was that he was no longer
in office. And look, and I would bring up one thing. The elector scheme was not, we didn't fully understand this elector scheme at the time of the impeachment hearing and the impeachment trial. I think I don't want to, we could play that what if. What if we understood the extent of the fake elector scheme? That would have created more intent. I would argue that the impeachment trial was almost more about January 6th and not enough about all of the stuff that what the Jack Smith indictment is about. So, there's a lot of those what if games. But at the end of the day, the elected Republican leadership chose to go another way. And look, why are we in this moment, Hallie? That's one of the reasons we're at this moment. Obviously, Donald Trump's decisions are the reason we're here, okay? But there are other ways this could have been handled. And once again, the Republican Party keeps ducking confronting their Trump issue.
With the legal piece of it over, and I want to pick up on the last thing that you just said, Chuck, at least over for now, meaning this arraignment, this moment, this appearance from the former president in court, as we've been talking about and as we'll talk more about. There is now the turning ahead, the looking ahead to the political piece of it. We mentioned the rallies that former President Trump will do. He will undoubtedly talk about this. And yet, Chuck, you bring up an important point, and I want to hear from Mark Murray on this, too. The Republican Party, his Republican rivals, are many of them continuing to back him up. Some of them, one of them, Nikki Haley, who is trying to register beyond single digits in the polls here, has not cleared that bar yet, is saying, we got to get past this drama. I don't have it in front of me at this moment. I'm drowning in papers. But she says something like, we should be focusing on economics. We should be focusing on the border. We shouldn't be trying to put, see whether or not this former president, 77-year-old former president, should be put behind bars or not. She says, I'm sick of the drama here. How much is that indictment fatigue? How much is that strategy? How much do you think that will resonate? Chuck Todd, if we have you, or else Mark Murray.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was Mark Murray. I was going to let Mark on that lead. Look, I understand what she's trying to say, but look, when Donald Trump's involved, everything revolves around him. And I think, let's not pretend this isn't, if she really wants to try to break through, I think you have to accept the premise that this is a referendum on Donald Trump. And you have to go right at it. Unless Donald Trump starts to regularly poll double digits behind Joe Biden in general election, right? Donald Trump's strength in the primary is in part due to Joe Biden's weakness in the general. If Biden were up double digits right now on Trump in a matchup, I promise you, the conversation inside the Republican primary would be a lot different, Hallie. There'd be this, hey, we can't nominate him. He can't beat Joe Biden, But that's not what the polling looks like. And as long as the polling shows it's competitive, and we're so polarized that it really doesn't matter who you put up there, right? The R versus the D seems to be where we're at. And that is among Trump's great strengths, because it takes away what I think could be a powerful argument, which is this guy can't win. But if it's on the margins, that's not what the polling says. Polling sure shows he could win. And as long as that stays the same, I think the other Republican candidates feel paralyzed on how to make the case against Trump.
Mark?
Hallie, I'll just say, going back to previous presidential primaries, they can be vicious competitions. We remember Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama fighting every inch of their health care plans, or what to do about the Iraq War, Hillary Clinton's vote authorizing the Iraq War. When Mitt Romney was running for the Republican nomination in the 2012 cycle, everything had to do with what he kind of wanted to create on health care in Massachusetts, looking at entitlement programs. And then even in 2016, as Chuck was kind of mentioning, it all became kind of about Donald Trump. But what is really striking in this early 2024 field right now is that you end up having a 3-time indicted frontrunner who keeps on increasing his lead after every single indictment and arraignment. And much of the Republican field, with some exceptions, has treated him with kid gloves when it comes to these indictments. And to me, that's just a stunning development, and maybe the most underreported development that we've seen so far in this Republican race. And, it would be worth to see if, this, continues. Maybe at one point, one of these candidates, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, despite her statement today, Tim Scott says, you know what, I'm really going to try to use this as a wedge issue. But it hasn't happened yet. And the repercussion is that the message that Republican primary voters get is, well, this must not be a big deal. If the former president of the United States is not being attacked by his rivals, this must not measure at all. And I would also argue that that's actually being amplified, too, by conservative media. When you're watching conservative media on Fox News, for example, they are defending Donald Trump. They are trying to poke every single hole into the indictment, into the arraignment. And I do think that that's having an impact on his lead and the perception among Republican primary voters about this.
Mark, thank you. Let me bring in our NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalos, who is with me here on set, along with Chuck Rosenberg, who is in Washington for us today. And Danny and Chuck, let me go to you on what we have just heard here in the last few minutes from the former president's defense team here, from the prosecutors in the courtroom, based on the information that we are getting from our team in court. One of the things that we heard from John Lauro, who was representing former President Trump, was the idea that they need more time. He said, we have a massive amount of discovery here to do. He said something like the government has had 3.5 years to conduct this investigation. That's not quite right. But his point is special counsel Jack Smith has had his hands on this stuff longer than John Lauro has. And he said, we need time to see what we got, get our arms around it, essentially. I'm paraphrasing here. What does that mean for how quickly we might see a trial, the possibility that a trial could extend beyond the November 2024 election? What's your sense?
You can save the tape on this one. The defense is not going to get 3.5 years in order to prepare the defense. That is not happening. But the defense has a point. This is a case where speedy trial, the Speedy Trial Act, really would benefit the government. It doesn't always. The Speedy Trial Act is designed for a defendant who gets arrested, they throw him in jail, and the government hasn't really put their case together. I shouldn't really say the government, because the government's pretty efficient. Usually it's a state prosecutor. They can't put their case together in time. They arrested at the time of the crime, so both defense and prosecution are building the case at the same time. And in those cases, sometimes the government or the prosecutor will let the case languish. Sometimes they have too many cases. They're not organized. And then speedy trial comes into play because you either have to put up or shut up, and the defendant can get the case dismissed. In this case, the government's already been investigating this case for some time, at least since last November. They're ready to go. They wouldn't have indicted the case unless they believe they have everything lined up and ready to go. All that remains for them is to take those little exhibit stickers and put them on their exhibits. They're ready. The defense is not ready. Could they be ready in 70 days? No way. Should they get 2 years? No way. But somewhere in the middle. The problem is the middle, Hallie, is smack dab in the middle of the campaign and the election.
So, Chuck, would a federal judge take that into consideration?
Well, I would hope not. but inevitably so. I mean, Danny is exactly right. When the government indicts a case like this, it is ready. They may, in fact, have already put the exhibit stickers on the exhibits. And 2 years is an outrageously long time, and 70 days may well be too short because at this point, the defense is catching up. However, I'm biased in the following way, Hallie. I come from the Eastern District of Virginia, which is known widely as the rocket docket because cases move with dispatch. They move quickly. Continuances are unusual. I often believe that was helpful to prosecutors because we do normally charge when we are ready to proceed to trial. Not always. Sometimes our hand is forced or a crime is stopped while it is occurring, and we charge it federally, and we are also playing catch up. But more often than not, the prosecution is ahead of the defense. I hope these cases can be resolved before the election. Remember, even if Mr. Trump wins next November, he doesn't take office until January of 2025. So there may be a little bit more time than we're actually talking about. But it can be done quickly as 70 days, unlikely. But I do think it can happen before the election. And I would hope it would happen before the election.
Chuck, because we're going to lose you to what I know are a million other obligations that you have, were you surprised to see that there was not a change of venue motion being made by the Trump defense team today? Is it possible that that could still come?
Oh, it's likely it will still come.
Okay.
It wouldn't be made today. Today would not be the appropriate time or place to make it. So I think two things will happen. They will move for a change of venue, arguing that they can't get a fair trial in D.C., and their motion for a change of venue will be denied, and they will have a trial in D.C.
I wish there was a second camera on Danny Savalas as you're speaking, Chuck, because he is vigorously nodding and charading along with you in agreement.
I was mouthing because you're absolutely right. I mean, the motion will be made. It'll be made more for the record than anything else. The motion will be denied. But look, as a defense attorney, you got to try everything you can. And by the way, this is the kind of case, this is the kind of defendant where trying everything you can and making a record is key, because appeals go up to the Court of Appeals, but the next stop on that road and the final stop is the Supreme Court. So anything that Trump's attorneys can try to get before the Supreme Court, and ideally before trial, not after trial, although in this case, in the D.C. case, there are limited, if any, opportunities to try and get a denied motion by the district judge, by the trial judge, up on appeal. For the most part, they're going to have to wait to appeal after, if he is convicted.
Chuck, reporting from the courtroom suggested that multiple other judges in the federal court were in the room where Donald Trump was being arraigned today. Is that typical? Would we normally see that? Or is their presence an indication of just how significant of a moment this is?
I'm trying to think about all the cases I tried and all the cases that were tried in my courthouse. And I think I can say, Hallie, that I have never seen anything like that before. That strikes me as unusual. When I heard that, I winced a little bit. I mean, today, Mr. Trump, for 27 minutes, was as ordinary a citizen as he could possibly be. He was a defendant in a criminal case. He stood like everyone else when the judge walked in. He sat when the judge sat. He was placed under oath. He answered questions with a no, Your Honor, or a yes, Your Honor. And when the judge departed, he stood again. I think that defendants in criminal cases should be treated with respect, and they should be treated alike. And anything that makes this more of a spectacle makes me uncomfortable.
There were at least 3 in there, potentially as many as 7 based on the reporting in the room, Chuck. I know you have to go. Thank you very much, Chuck Todd. Mark Murray, I'm coming back to you in a second, but I want to get out to Aaron Gilchrist, who is outside the courthouse now, as we are starting to get some of the sketches in from inside the room. Aaron, security intense. It looks like most of the crowd is dissipated. Part of that is because Donald Trump's gone. Part of it, I bet, is because it's kind of drizzly back home.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was actually raining much harder a few minutes ago, and we did see a lot of people scatter as the rain was coming down harder. We moved across the street, but you can still see some of the crowd that's still gathered out here. There was someone with a megaphone who was using a lot of profanity, so we moved away a little bit. But you can still see there are lots of signs and flags up. These on this corner here, these are mostly folks who are anti-Trump, if you will, who've gathered outside the courthouse here. The police presence has reduced significantly in the last few minutes as well. Across the street, there are still some police officers, D.C. police officers, as well as a few demonstrators who've sort of hung out here outside the courthouse a little bit longer. On this side, we can tell you that there are still D.C. police officers who have blocked the street that was sort of the direct route that the former president took to get into the courthouse. The barricades are still up as well. But as things here went as smoothly as they could have gone, as smoothly as the law enforcement here in D.C. wanted things to go. I think we saw just a few dozen people, really, demonstrators gather here, and for the most part, they were loud, but they weren't creating any sort of conflicts with each other here. And as we know that the former president should be back for another hearing late in August, we would imagine that there will be crowds here that gather again outside this courthouse, which is just a block off the National Mall in the shadow of the U.S. Capitol, Hallie.
Thank you, Aaron. As we are showing now a sketch from inside court, you can see Donald Trump the moment he entered that not guilty plea to the 4 federal charges, the counts that he is facing now, as he was in federal custody, as our team has pointed out, for 27 minutes, not unlike any other defendant in the state, in the district, I should say, of Columbia. In the United States of America, but certainly an extraordinary moment here. Part of that is underscored, Tom Winter, by another image that we've seen. I want to pull it up. As Donald Trump was getting out of his car to get onto his plane at Washington Reagan National Airport, you see the guy holding the umbrella for him? That's Walt Nauta. That's the co-defendant in the other federal case against former President Trump. It is a striking image that illustrates, I think, the sort of legal web that the former president faces.
100%, Hallie. And I mean, you know, from covering the former president during his campaign and at the White House, his inner circle is truly this gelled, loyal group of people. I spoke to an investigator who's been involved, not in this particular case, but involved in some of the cases against Donald Trump. And they said to me, of all the cases and all the investigations and everything they've ever been involved in, federal, state, they have never seen an inner circle so loyal to a person as Trump's inner circle is so loyal to him. Alan Weisselberg, his CFO, facing significant jail time in New York in a state prosecution, kept on board with the Trump team. Even after he was indicted, they held a birthday party for him, and he attended. I think that's just a great example of the closeness of this team and potentially the challenge. And I think this is going to be the next step, and particularly in the Florida case where the federal prosecutors have already filed the Garcia motion to ask some questions of some of the people that have been charged in that case, of saying, hey, are you aware that your defense attorneys are also defense attorneys for some of the other people who are either potential witnesses or potential defendants or defendants in this case? And do they have your best interests in mind? And I think as we see this inner circle and more members of it get in a legal jam, so to speak, I think there's going to be more questions as to whether or not people are getting their best defense, if you will. I think prosecutors, they've already filed in Florida, are making those same requests or asking those same questions as well. So I think that's going to be something important to follow. And then, as we know from FEC filings this week, in a work of our NBC political unit, they tracked over $20 million from a PAC associated with Trump that's been used to pay attorneys. And so we're still digging through that money to figure out which attorney is getting what and then who are they paying for the defense for. But I think that image that you've so importantly keyed in on of Walt Nauta holding the umbrella for former President Trump today, just a few miles down the road, it just shows how close this circle is and the potential problems for prosecutors or the potential opportunities for them as well, Hallie.
We have also seen Donald Trump, as he has said on the tarmac, he said it many times at rallies and elsewhere, that he believes that he, in this investigation and others, is being politically persecuted. Some of his Republican campaign rivals have echoed that. And the reason for that, it seems, is partly because of where the Republican primary electorate is. I want to bring in one of our NBC News campaign correspondents, Dasha Burns. And Dasha, we have a set of numbers that show that 7 in 10, 8 in 10 Republican voters, or likely Republican voters, believe that Donald Trump should be backed by the rest of the party in the face of these legal challenges. You are posted up, of course, in Bedminster, New Jersey, as the former president is on his way back to you as we speak.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hallie. And that's probably why you've got this reaction from his primary rivals that is, really trying to walk a tightrope here. The most surprising and perhaps the only surprising reaction came from Vice President Mike Pence, who dropped some new campaign swag today with the words "too honest," which, of course, refers to a comment Trump made in response to Pence refusing to reject the electoral count. He also referred to Trump's lawyers as crackpots. This is kind of Pence on the loose, which is something we haven't really seen before. But in terms of his other primary rivals, the reaction was really true to form. I want you to take a listen to some of what we heard.
You cannot have our overall legal system as a weaponizing tool.
I do think that on this same set of facts, anyone not named Trump would not have been indicted.
Donald Trump had misled them. From day one, he knew that he had lost the election, but yet he continued to fight that. That fact should disqualify him from being president.
Hutchinson there, of course, an outlier. You've got rivals using the same words that Donald Trump uses, which is this system has been weaponized, two-tiered system of justice. And that's something, Hallie, that I know you've heard as much as I have. A lot of Republican voters are really buying into.
Dasha Burns, thank you. I want to go now to Julie Sirkin, who is live for us on Capitol Hill. And Julie, as we talk about the moments in the room in court today at the federal courthouse, several police officers who were at the Capitol on January 6th attended. They were there. They spoke about their experience afterwards. We have seen these same individuals throughout, for example, the January 6th congressional hearings. Now, again, and I want to be clear, this indictment does not go after former President Trump for issues of, for example, incitement or for creating the violence at the Capitol. It's more about the broader scheme, the bigger plot to overturn the 2020 election. But this moment still seems significant for those officers. Talk us through it.
Yeah, absolutely, Hallie. I was texting a few of them when they decided to make this journey to the courthouse. They didn't even know if they were going to be able to gain access, of course, due to the limited spaces for public citizens to attend. They were attending as public citizens. Harry Dunn, of course, the U.S. Capitol Police officer who responded on January 6th. You saw him there in his plain clothes yesterday, by the way. He was one of the officers actually responding to that false active shooter alarm. But all of these moments are so important for these officers. One of them, Staff Sergeant Aquilino Ganel, actually left the force because of the physical and mental injuries that he sustained from January 6th. He put out a statement, a really heartfelt, emotional statement that he sent me a few moments ago, where he said, quote, "Our democracy is worth fighting for. Not prosecuting is far riskier than having no consequences for the alleged power grab attempts," he says, in reference to the former president. Justice and the rule of law must win for our democracy to survive. We also heard from Dunn on our air last hour. I want you to take a listen to some of what he had to say after he left the courtroom today.
It definitely was emotional, definitely was intense. At one point, I looked down, my watch started going off. I looked at my heart rate. It was over 100 beats a minute. So surreal, but definitely needed along the way for what we've been fighting for all along is accountability and justice.
Hallie, you're right to point out that Dunn, Ganel, even Daniel Hodges, who's a Metro police officer who was also with them in the room today, they attended every single January 6th Select Committee hearing. They, of course, provided testimony during that first open hearing the committee had. They've been involved in this process, whether being a part of it in uniform on that day, protecting this building since, or just being a witness to what is going on, this moment in history as this more than 2 years later situation continues to evolve. They said, by the way, that they will try to be at the next hearing as well. They told me in a text if they're able to. So this is clearly something they feel like they need to see through to the finish.
Julie Sirkin live for us on Capitol Hill. Julie, thank you for that. Chuck Todd, let me bring you back into the conversation, because to me, what we've been talking about speaks to the point that you have been making, I think, really since we learned that this target letter was coming and this indictment was happening, which is it didn't have to be like this. Right.
No, and that's again, we have this amazing stress test, unfortunately, on our legal system, our political system, perhaps even the Constitution. And again, it's because of the dereliction of duty of elected officials. And that's what's so frustrating here. Look, I mean, you know, Donald Trump is the reason who is the one trying to destroy guardrails. So, you know, I don't want to sit here and sort of, you know, let him off the hook. But, you know, as many people point out, he didn't take control of the Republican Party. They've sort of handed it to him, right? Whether it's the way Lindsey Graham has behaved over the last 5 years, or you could go through any number of officials. He's probably one of the better examples of watching this. And it's just sort of, you shake your head, because it is not in the best interest of the Republican Party. It is not in the best interest of the conservative movement. If you truly care about small government, fiscal discipline, some of these things, you know, trying to get, you know, this is not the way to do it. This is hurting the movement, if you will. And so this is why you sit here and you know, we are putting the rule of law on the ballot. What have we done? And I sit here and I go back to the decision by Mitch McConnell to view the impeachment trial as a technicality, because it took place after Donald Trump left office. At the end of the day, his actions in office there, post-election through there, I mean, the idea that impeachment wasn't the right venue, it's clear they were just, it goes back, you made this point when I made it the first time during the special, they cared more about the House and the Senate in 2022. I mean, look, I am happy to play this what-if game.
But can I just...
There's no doubt. By the way, there's no doubt. It would have ripped the party apart. It would have been an awful 2 years for the party. Here's what I also promise you. Whenever Donald Trump leaves the stage, it's going to be an awful year for the Republican Party. When you rip this Band-Aid off, it's going to be terrible. But the longer you delay it, the more you put all of us in jeopardy of the whole thing crumbling if we're not careful.
Can I just, you know, you talk about the idea of the House potentially being in jeopardy. I mean, I'm talking with this today who brought up the specter of the House next cycle, right? Like the idea that the Republican Party's fortunes in Congress, in the Capitol, right? Less so the Senate, but the House, are so directly tied to Donald Trump's political fortunes, too. I mean, you see it. I think a lot of people see it, the people holding their nose, some Republicans voting for Donald Trump. There's also some Republicans who hear conversations about former President Trump, who are maybe not, you know, Trump loyalists, so to speak, but who do believe that he is not getting a fair shake from members of the media, from, you know, the federal government, et cetera, that do believe that there has been some political interference here.
Well, I think, though, that it's only Donald Trump to blame for that, right? The way he's treated the system, you could argue, has made many of those folks that they say are somehow biased against him. They don't know any other way to look at it because of the way he's behaved. So, you know, they're upset at the system, but it's, I mean, I would argue, my goodness, he got kid glove treatment for the classified documents. They basically said, well, can you hand it over? Can we have a meeting? Remember, I mean, they went through 18 months of this before they finally said, all right, now you're making us do a subpoena. Now you're making us do this. I mean, he has forced these confrontations. And I think when you get these elected Republicans in a room, when there's not a camera on, you hear it too. They're like, well, you're right. Yes, he brings this on himself. Yes, he's done this. But let me tell you something else. I also, if you think about the average elected official, they care about surviving the next election. Every one of them, left or right, most of them care about surviving the next election. And the reason why so many of them are standing behind Donald Trump is they are afraid that there is a chunk of Republican voters that only love Donald Trump. And that if somehow Donald Trump is not on this ballot, is somehow ostracized from the party, they're out. They're not showing up. And you know the proof that many of these folks use? They'll sit there and say, look at 2012. And then look at 2016 and 2020. House Republicans did much better running with Donald Trump in 16 and 20 than they did running with Mitt Romney in 12. And why is that? Because Donald Trump does bring some people out that didn't show up and vote in 8 and 12. There was a missing group of voters that had given up on politics, and he animated them. And this is his power over the party. Yeah. The party has convinced himself. I've heard Lindsey Graham make this argument publicly and privately. He said no Republican can win an election in South Carolina by being anti-Trump, which is why he flipped. He cared more about keeping his Senate seat. It's a pragmatic decision. I get it if you care more about winning re-election. And right now, the House Republicans have a better shot running with Trump than not. That's the irony here, even though it's probably worse for the party and certainly worse for Senate Republicans.
Chuck Todd, thank you. I want to talk about somebody who we haven't talked about because he is not talking about this yet, and that is President Biden, who is not in New York, obviously. He is not in Washington. He is out in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where he is spending part of his August. Mike Memoli is traveling with the president. And Mem, even though the president is not talking about the former president and his allies sure are talking about Joe Biden, and even more so his son, Hunter Biden. The president has tried to keep an arm's length distance from this. He doesn't want to talk about it. He wants to show, right, that the White House, the executive branch, has a level of distance from the other piece of the executive branch, the Department of Justice here in this investigation. And yet we have seen cranked up to an 11, frankly, the sort of Hunter Biden attacks today, and Republican allies of the former president trying to draw an equivalency here with, of course, President Biden's son, Hunter, agreeing to that plea deal, essentially, the ongoing investigation against him for unrelated reasons having to do with taxes, et cetera.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. I mean, and what I hear from Biden allies, from Democratic sources, whenever we raise what Republicans are trying to make, the case they're trying to make about Hunter Biden, they say this is very obviously a strategy designed to draw a false equivalency between the former president's legal troubles and what the president and his family may or may not be facing in terms of investigations on Capitol Hill. They're actually arguing that this is intentional, that there is a coincidence. They point to a pattern of instances when the former president gets indicted or faces some sort of new revelation as it relates to the various probes that are landing him in federal court, with actions that the House Oversight Committee is taking, for instance. We saw today, timed to what we knew was happening all day with the former president, the House Oversight Committee released sooner than we were expecting, frankly, a full transcript of the interview that took place just a few days ago with Devin Archer. He's a former business partner of Hunter Biden. And in that closed-door testimony, we see in plain writing now the repeated denials on the part of Devin Archer that any of the interactions that were happening between Hunter Biden and his father by telephone when Hunter Biden was sitting down with some business partners were not about what Republicans were trying to say, which was, an example of his involvement with his businesses, but much more routine. And so as we're talking about this repeated White House strategy, which is to not comment, to make it clear that there is a firewall between the Justice Department and the president himself, I'm really struck by the contrasts, Hallie, as we've been spending the week here. It was Tuesday night, as Jack Smith was addressing the nation, talking about the charges that he was unsealing at that point. The president was on his way to dinner. He was going to the movies with the First Lady. Today, we saw him again riding his bike, the former president getting off of his plane in Washington wearing a dark suit and a red tie, or the former president here wearing a bathing suit with turtles on it, right? So these are the kind of split screen moments that we're seeing throughout the week that are just so jarring. And frankly, the Biden team likes it that way. They sort of enjoy this split screen of a president who's got his head down, is focused, well, this week focused on a little bit of R&R, but otherwise has been focused on governing, while Trump has just been continued to be a wrecking ball in politics, very bombastic on social media and other settings as well. And that's the strategy we're going to continue to see play out in the months ahead.
It is the strategy we'll see play out months ahead as we talk about the way that there is a collision course now between both the political calendar and the legal calendar. Danny Savalos, I'll come to you on that piece of it, because at this moment, we know that the next court appearance related to this case is going to be in just a few weeks in August. There is also the specter of what's happening in Fulton County, Georgia, which is the potential, and we don't know for sure, but the potential for Donald Trump to face a fourth indictment now, related to the same set of circumstances. We believe this sort of broader scheme to try to overturn the election. The district attorney there has said she will say by Labor Day, basically, whether she's charging Donald Trump or not. Well, we are in that final window here. She said today that she has read Jack Smith's indictment. However, one does not have to do with the other, right? One is state in Georgia. What we're talking about with Jack Smith is federal.
Yes, but some of the allegations relate to Georgia in the indictment, in the section titled Georgia. So there are allegations, and the prosecutor in Fulton County will be looking at that. And I can't help but think it's going to, whether unconsciously or consciously, influence some of the decisions down there. After all, the thinking may go, if the federal government thinks they have a case beyond a reasonable doubt, well, where does that leave us? But even with that, I would not rule out the possibility that there are charges in Fulton County and Donald Trump may not be listed as one of the defendants, because the approach that Jack Smith took was to go after Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone. And that seems to be part of the strategy to focus in on him and get his trial done before the election. However, I can see another universe where a Fulton County DA decides that there are a number of minions that operated below Donald Trump. For example, the unindicted co-conspirators that appear in the federal indictment. I could see a prosecutor equally deciding that those are the main culprits, going after them, naming them, and maybe leaving Donald Trump out, thinking perhaps that, well, even if he was at the top of this group of people trying to overturn the election, the people who are boots on the ground in the trenches, they may have more culpability in the eyes of another prosecutor. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Donald Trump somehow escapes indictment in Fulton County. But at the same time, now that we've seen a federal indictment based on charges alleged in Georgia, I wouldn't be that surprised if he was a defendant.
Danny Savalos, thank
you.
Well, you are an attorney, after all.
That's
thank
what I
you.
do.
I'm going to ask you to stand by right you are, and to thank everybody who's been with us for the past 30 minutes of coverage. We've got another hour of coverage coming up. It is now 6 o'clock Eastern, the top of the hour. I'm Hallie Jackson with our continuing coverage here on NBC News Now. Let's take a beat. Here's where we are as we speak. Former President Donald Trump is in the air. He's in his plane heading back to New Jersey after a moment that is making history in this country. Because for the first time ever, we have seen now a former president of the U.S. pleading not guilty to accusations he tried to overturn an election. It was a dramatic 27 minutes in court as Donald Trump was read those counts that he faces based on his lies about fraud in the legitimate 2020 election. He responded that he was not guilty, and in the last hour, he's calling himself a victim of political persecution. Watch.
This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it. When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America.
That is something we have heard from former President Trump again and again, but never on a day when he's been arraigned on those charges, until at least for now. I want to show the only picture we have so far of him from the courtroom. Here it is. It is a sketch because, remember, there were no cameras in court. That was something that is not permitted in federal court. And there is now an open question. When his trial happens, will we be able to see it? Will we be able to hear it? Will there be live audio, for example, an audio live stream? That is something that we will talk about coming up later this hour, a question folks have. Remember, the indictment, I want to show you here. You can kind of see it in this picture. Former President Trump. It's not like Law and Order, where you have the judge in the middle and the two tables, the defense and the prosecution on either side. They were facing each other, quite directly facing each other. You can see on the other side the prosecutors for the U.S. government. In the room, special counsel Jack Smith, who is now bringing his second federal indictment against Donald Trump. You see him here. Jack Smith, based on the reporting from inside the courtroom, was looking around. He was assessing former President Trump, as former President Trump was doing as well. There's a lot of evidence here in this case, including in-the-moment notes from former Vice President Mike Pence, including emails from senior Justice Department employees, and including information about unauthorized, fake, or alternative elector ballots that were introduced as part of this alleged plot. It is a wide-ranging indictment from the Justice Department, and we will see how it plays out in court. I want to bring in now our team who's covering all of this for us. Let me get to Garrett Hake, who's live for us in Washington. We have Chuck Todd, our political director, who's joining us as well. Tom Winter, who is also outside federal court, our investigative correspondent. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos, and NBC News political unit director Mark Murray. Garrett, I want to start with you, and I want to pull back the curtain a bit to how this unfolded. Tiny courtroom, not big. Tons of interest, tons of people, only about 11 seats for members of the media inside court, only, I think, fewer than a half a dozen for members of the public, right? I mean, this was a packed courtroom, lots of security, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals. You happen to have one of those seats. Tell us what we should know and where this goes.
Yeah, Hallie, every seat in this courtroom was taken, and I've been in all three courtrooms now, and I realized as I was thinking through this that this is the first time that in the courtroom were people who were actually affected by the crimes that were alleged against Donald Trump. There were journalists who covered the attack on the Capitol. There were, in the overflow rooms, who couldn't even get into the courtroom, police officers who were attacked on that day, who wanted to be in the room to see Donald Trump stand in front of a judge. And in fact, there were other judges who've tried other January 6th cases and their families who all wanted to be in that courtroom today for this moment, to watch Donald Trump stand in front of a judge and, in this case, plead not guilty. Now, I was struck by the fact that there's now on his third arraignment, Donald Trump seems more comfortable in this environment than he did the first time. Now, look, this is someone who's used to being in control, not used to being made to wait or be told to stand or told when he has to speak or when he has to sit. And that's what happens in this environment where a judge is in control. That said, he was looser. He was chatting with his attorneys throughout. But even sort of more looser than he and more clearly in command of the room was Jack Smith, not seated at the prosecution's table, but just behind it in a row reserved for other court officials, but not actually participating in this. Smith had his security details surrounding him. He was chatting with other lawyers, and he was trying to watch Donald Trump throughout these proceedings. Trump, I think, kind of did a quick check, saw Smith in the room when he walked in, and then did everything he could not to look at him again for the remainder of the hearing. But Smith, was congratulating his FBI agents. He was congratulating his prosecutors afterwards, making it clear that this is a home game for these prosecutors who have been working in many cases on January 6th related cases, or on this case that was building against Donald Trump, first at the Justice Department and then in the special counsel's office for 2.5 years. So there was a sense of gravity to that moment, Hallie, that this is something that has been being built towards since that attack on the Capitol just up the street 2.5 years ago.
We know from you and from others in the room that there were about a half dozen other judges sitting in the back of the courtroom, which Chuck Rosenberg told us a few minutes ago he has never in his experience ever seen. You can see a list of them here. Judge Amy Berman Jackson, the chief judge, for example, in federal court. You make the point, and I think it's a good one, that unlike, there is something else that's different about this particular arraignment, that unlike the previous two, inside court today were people actually affected by the crimes that have been alleged against Mr. Trump, not just these judges, some of whom have tried January 6th defendant cases, meaning Capitol rioter cases, but police officers who were attacked, which we'll talk about with Julie Sirkin in a minute, and journalists who were in the Capitol when this happened.
Yeah, Hallie, that's exactly right. I mean, look, in the other two arraignments, whatever you think of the merits of those cases, the victims of the crimes that are alleged are a little bit more theoretical, right? They're New York taxpayers, let's say, or Americans who might be harmed by the damaging of disclosure of national security secrets, what have you. There are hundreds, if not more than that, of real victims in the January 6th sort of family of crimes here that are alleged. And I think seeing what happened in the courtroom today was important to many of them, important to those officers, and I think important to these judges who've been sentencing people to, in some cases, lengthy prison terms for their roles in the actual attack that is alleged to have been inspired, if not, directly ordered by Donald Trump at the end of this conspiracy that is alleged in this indictment. So, yes, I think sort of a broad sense of finality and or at least of a turning of the page here, and of a sense of this is sort of a moment that people needed to physically see and experience for themselves.
Garrett, I'm going to let you go. I know you got to run over to Nightly News in just a couple of minutes here. Thank you for your reporting and for being with us as you are looking live now on the other side of the screen at former President Trump's plane landing now back in New Jersey. He is heading back to his home at Bedminster, where he will spend some time before hitting the campaign trail. Again, this is all happening. I mean, listen, he left for Washington, maybe not 4 or 4.5 hours ago, a very quick trip for the former president, but a very significant one. As Tom Winter well knows, he is posted up in Washington outside federal court. And Tom, some key moments there from the judge, who appeared to acknowledge the gravity of the day and gravity of the moment. In somewhat pro forma language, she pointed out that this arraignment may be short, but it is significant. That takes on a different context when you're talking about the former president of the United States.
I mean, without a doubt. We talk about the potential items of evidence in this case. We talk about the potential witnesses. The former vice president of the United States, Mike Pence. We talk about perhaps the former attorney general of the United States, his top senior officials, top campaign officials. state legislatures, state representatives, state attorney generals from all over this country in contested states. These are serious people with serious titles who might be called to testify against the person who was once in the Oval Office. So, yes, we've never had anything like this in modern times. As far as the courthouse behind me, I think it was important what Garrett pointed out, that Donald Trump was treated like anybody else today. And the whole idea of a first appearance is to bring somebody in and let them know, hey, you're now part of the criminal process. I'm the judge. I'm here to advise you of your rights. I'm here to advise you of the charges against you. If you want the indictment read into the record, you can. And it's on now. There's a trial clock. Motions will be filed. Things will be argued. Things will be discussed. And at some point here, barring a plea agreement, which I don't think anybody foresees in this particular case, we're going to trial at some point. Obviously, the caveat of if that trial date is after there's an election and if Donald Trump is elected, then we're in kind of uncharted territory. But again, we're in uncharted territory. So, yes, a historic day, no doubt. Next things on the calendar here, Hallie, in 7 days, federal prosecutors have been ordered to give the judge a sense of when they would like to go to trial. The defense will then have an opportunity to respond. There'll be a protective order that will come in. That'll mean the rules by which Donald Trump and his attorneys can or cannot share the evidence that is exchanged with them. Then they'll get that as part of discovery. And then August 28th, they'll be before the judge, who will be handling this trial. Trump does not have to appear personally for that particular hearing. And that's the same with a lot of these hearings, by the way, from here on out. The defense has telegraphed that they want to file for a change of venue. United States versus Tsarnaev, United States versus Saipov, the decisions and precedent established in Skilling versus the United States. Several of those trials I've covered. It is typically a dead-on-arrival motion. The courts are very clear in that matter that typically the judge in the home district of where the offense occurred is where that trial should be held, and any questions about juror impartiality can be addressed on voir dire. So that's what we should expect to see in the coming couple of months. I'll leave it to our legal analysts to kind of guide us through here what they should expect in the types of tea leaves that we can be reading. But the former president of the United States is directly in the barrels of a trial that will occur or should occur based on the schedule at some point here, Hallie.
Tom, thank you. And careful, you might get yourself roped into co-hosting with me here because we are going to go to our legal analyst, Danny Savalos, to talk through what Tom is referencing here, some of those tea leaves and the way that we can think about Donald Trump's team making a defense here. There seem to be a few different buckets, if you will, right?
Yeah.
First, there's the First Amendment free speech bucket. He can say what he wants. This is a free country. He's allowed to say stuff. Fine. Second, there is this kind of, well, he was taking his lawyers' advice bucket that they may try to float here. Interestingly, several of we haven't even talked about this, but unindicted co-conspirators named in the indictment, there are 6 of them. I think at least 4 are attorneys, and we don't know the 6th, right? So there is that sort of factor there that I want you to talk about. Where else do you see them trying to put up a defense for Donald Trump? And more importantly, what do you think is most likely to stick here?
We've talked about advice of counsel. Advice of counsel is fraught with peril. The main reason is that he would have to get up and testify on the stand that is the advice that I received from my attorneys. Now,
but that opens him up to cross-examination.
Yes, and that is the disaster scenario. He does not want to take the stand. But, Donald Trump, maybe he insists on it. He has a constitutional right to take the stand. And, lately, in the last few years, I have seen increasingly defendants take the stand and some of them get acquitted. So there seems to be a reevaluation of the old rule, which is you never, ever, 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 ever put your client on the stand in a criminal case. But instead of the advice of counsel, I might back out a little bit and make a more broad kind of defense.
Please.
And it would be like this. It would be to put the election on trial itself, to the extent the judge lets me, because if I can introduce evidence that there was not necessarily advice coming from counsel, but more generally in the air, generally information flowing to Donald Trump, that this election was compromised, even though there were many people telling him that it was not. If there were enough people telling him that it was, then you put the Electoral Count Act on trial as well, say it's overly confusing, and then you argue that that same law allows for candidates to aggressively, to arm twist, to fight, to bite, to argue, to elbow, to do whatever they can to try and get elected. And that is essentially politics as usual. Both sides do it. Democrats, Republicans, everyone does everything they can to get elected. And a bit of aggressive politics when it comes to campaigning and when it comes to election night and the weeks afterward, including filing suits or whatever else you may do, is not only legal, it's expected, and it happens all the time. That's an example of a potential defense. Will it work? I don't know.
There has also been an interesting juxtaposition of a legal defense from the former president's legal team and a political defense from some of those same attorneys and from people close to and around former President Trump. Chuck Todd, I want to bring you in on this because that is important. It is important because Donald Trump is making a case. His team more broadly is making a case to the sizable portion of the Republican primary electorate who think Donald Trump is not getting a fair shake, who believe that the Republican Party should back him. 45%, according to new polling today, of these Republican voters say they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump if he was convicted, but that means more than half of Republican voters probably would.
I've seen that poll, and they didn't ask a specific. They said a felony crime, right? But if his voters don't believe this is a crime, if he's convicted, my point is I wouldn't hang your hat on this poll. I think it's a poorly worded question. They did not ask about this case. They specifically worded a felony crime. And I think for many voters, they hear felony crime and they think, oh, maybe he shot somebody, maybe he did this. So I would, again, our friends at Ipsos, terribly worded question. Sorry, don't mean to throw shade at them, but that's why I take that number with a big grain of salt.
Fine, but how about this number, which is I don't think you should take with a grain. I mean, you tell me if I should take it with a grain of salt. That 7 in 10 Republicans think that the party should coalesce around the former president, and that most of them do not believe that he has done anything seriously wrong.
Yeah, no, those numbers, and it's from a different pollster. I think they ask better. It is more a direct question. Look, he has done a good job of gaslighting the Republican Party about all of these legal problems that he has, right? He announced early so that he could be an announced candidate, so that he could use that he could claim when the indictments came, which were already, he was being investigated essentially since the day he left office. He knew they were coming, and he wanted to be an announced candidate when they came. If you recall, he thought, and a lot of us thought, he was going to get his first indictment sometime before the end of the calendar year in 2022. So he wanted to fully be a candidate, and he did that in order to now claim, hey, they're just coming after me because I'm an announced candidate for president. So look, I think politically, they have done this is a remarkable job of completely reframing the conversation with his group of voters. Now, we live in a system where we have this, siloed out way that people consume information, and Donald Trump has exploited that to his benefit, right? So he creates this bravado that nothing bothers me, it's not going to hurt me, and if I think it's not going to hurt me, then the elected Republicans will stand behind me. So, look, I think I go back to a simple thing. I do believe if Donald Trump were trailing Joe Biden by double digits in general election polls, we'd be having a much different conversation, Hallie. And, at the end of the day, most elected officials put their finger in the wind and see which way the wind's blowing. And at the end of the day, there are 70% of Republican voters want to rally behind Trump, which means more than 70% of elected Republicans are going to rally around Trump.
Chuck Todd, we're glad to have you with us today on this, frankly, historic day here where you are in Washington and also where I am here up in New York, at least not too far from where we're sitting in New Jersey. That is the live picture that you're seeing on the left side of your screen. That, of course, is the former president's plane that has landed now in Newark. As he is getting ready to deplane, he's going to head to Bedminster ahead of, frankly, several months filled with campaign rallies and almost certainly more discussion about the legal challenges that he faces. Dasha Burns is live in Bedminster for us. She is joining us now. And Dasha, it's not just former President Trump talking about this. Other Republican candidates for the White House are being asked about this. At least one of them tonight, Nikki Haley, has suggested she's over it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for the most part, the responses haven't been fully surprising. Nikki Haley, though, is an example of the slight change in tone that we are starting to hear, Hallie. Look, it's not been a huge turn of the page for folks, but we are starting to hear a slight change in tone on this third indictment now of their opponent, of the front runner in this race. And I want you to take a listen to what Nikki Haley had to say.
like most Americans, I'm tired of commenting on every Trump drama. I've lost track of whether this indictment is the third, fourth, or the fifth. Donald Trump bears some responsibility for what happened, but Trump didn't attack the Capitol. It's not a crime to say that you think an election was stolen. He should not be prosecuted for that.
So you've got part one, and then you've got part two, still a defense of her opponent. And Hallie, sometimes when I listen to the Republican rivals of the former president, I feel like we're living in upside down land. I mean, can you imagine you've got someone you're running against, a guy that's been indicted 3 times now, and instead of saying to voters, hey, my opponent's been indicted 3 times, you say you've got a 2-tier justice system, you've got a weaponized justice system, or he didn't really do anything wrong, he shouldn't be punished for this. It's just such an uncanny moment in history and in an election. The one rival, though, that could be really dangerous for Trump here, and I don't mean in terms of poll numbers or votes, but I mean legally and potentially politically, is his former running mate, is former Vice President Mike Pence, because he is a guy who has the receipts. We saw this in the indictment. He took contemporaneous notes of Trump's pressure campaign, and he has become much more vocal, Hallie, than he ever has been in recent days. Just today, dropping a new line of campaign swag with the words "too honest" on it, which of course is a response, his response to what Trump said to him when he rejected the pressure to reject electoral counts. And we just learned from our colleague Ryan Riley, who spoke with 3 officers who attended the hearing. Former Sergeant Gonal said that he hopes Mike Pence, quote, has the cojones to speak up about what he witnessed. And it'll be really interesting to see in the coming days, as it does seem Pence is starting to heat up his rhetoric, whether or not he does come out and say more about what it is that he witnessed and the testimony that he gave before the grand jury. It is very likely, Hallie, that he's going to have to take the stand, and it's possible that his former boss's freedom might hinge on the former vice president and potentially the man that put his life in danger, Hallie.
Dasha Burns, live for us in Bedminster, covering all things 2024, as she has been for months. Dasha, thank you. Danny, to that point, would Mike Pence have to testify in a trial against Donald Trump?
Sure, why not? I mean, he might claim executive privilege. I don't think it would work, because I don't know that he might even claim, again, try to trot out that as essentially the nominal head of the Senate, that he might even have congressional immunity. He's trotted that out before. Yeah. You can try it again in court. I don't know that it would work, but I think it's very likely that we might see Mike Pence testify. And I would add that the government must feel confident that if needed, they can bring in Mike Pence to testify, because he features so prominently in the indictment. The government, these guys, they really think out what they're doing. They would not take this case to an indictment if they thought, well, hey, guys, we've got good evidence, but let's just plan on not having Mike Pence as a witness because he's going to win on privilege and all these other things. Or maybe they've even gotten from him, this is just speculation, everything about the way Mike Pence has produced evidence or testified has been one of those, in my view, to my eyes, that he wants to symbolically maybe oppose it, but he doesn't really truly have a problem complying with the investigation. That's just my take, my sense from watching him. But yes, it's likely he could testify. I think the government must know they can get him to testify, or they feel confident about it, because he is a very important witness in this case, in this indictment.
It's an interesting point, and we will see how that piece of it unfolds. I want to get now to, as we talk about, by the way, I want to point out what you're seeing on screen here, too. The deplaning now of the people traveling with former President Trump, including, some people who were part of that indictment, who were, if not named directly, then at least alluded to, senior campaign advisors. He's been traveling with his top campaign staff, kind of his inner circle here. When you talk about former Vice President Mike Pence, what's referenced in the indictment are his notes, contemporaneous notes that he's taken. I've gotten the question from people, well, why was he taking those notes? His top aide came out and suggested, well, it's for his memoir, which, by the way, Mike Pence did write. He wrote about his time in the White House. Sure. It is not atypical for top officials to keep notes. And when those were subpoenaed, his top aide said he had no choice, he felt, but to turn those over. As we're taking now a look and preparing to see former President Trump deplane there in Newark, not too far from where I'm sitting here in New York City, and head over to Bedminster. Back home, and go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we were talking about, in talking about Mike Pence, just to add on, one of the things we talked about, a few minutes ago over at across the street during coverage of this, is the idea that Mike Pence, I wouldn't dismiss the idea, and I think Chuck actually brought this up. I thought this was brilliant. I've been rolling it over in my head like a law school essay exam ever since. But the idea that Donald Trump could stand on that stage at a debate and say something offhand to Mike Pence like, just for example, you're a snitch, or you are a traitor. Even that snitch kind of language, believe me, prosecutors, they prosecute witness intimidation with a vengeance. And I don't know the statistics, but just based on my observation, prosecuting witness intimidators is on the rise. They do not take that lightly. And certainly Jack Smith, if he's watching a debate, his team is watching Trump on the debate stage, and Trump makes some comment to Mike Pence about you're a traitor or you're a snitch or you're a rat, then I wouldn't be surprised if you see Jack Smith and team going to court and saying he is in violation of his pretrial release conditions. Chuck, I mean, I've been rolling that around in my head ever since you said it.
Chuck, you're still with us. I thought you had to run. Jump in.
No, it's if you follow the rule to the letter of the law, and I say this, I would love to write the essay, see if I would pass your class. Danny,
I'm an easy grader, believe me.
Look, I'm just, when I retire, I think I want to go to law school. I've always wanted to go to the law school without having to actually practice law. But, you throw that in there. And I go back, and Danny, I'd like you to address that other issue. Because I do think, look, what Trump has said, I mean, he did put Pence's life in danger in different ways. And if he said that, you could picture him saying that. But I keep going back to, he's got people, one of the perhaps co-conspirator number 6 travels with him, okay? Again, we have not been able to confirm what another news organization did about who co-conspirator number 6 is. Does the government have a duty to inform the defendant that, hey, be careful here, one of them is him?
Yes, through discovery, but discovery won't be in the inbox for some time. So I would expect informally, if the government is planning to keep Trump from really talking to co-conspirators, you're right. I mean, there really is only one remaining that there's any real doubt about. But technically, they're all unnamed, unindicted co-conspirators. So, I mean, the government certainly has an interest in making a phone call to defense counsel and saying, hey, here's the score.
We are seeing former President Trump, by the way, walk down those stairs off his plane, getting in the motorcade, or the car at least. He's going to be heading back to Bedminster. As we are already starting to hear from his allies writ large on Capitol Hill and beyond. Our Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin is with us with some new reporting on House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Julie, bring us up to speed.
Yeah, Hallie. Well, he's still talking at a local event in California, but he was asked some questions about 20 minutes into this press conference from some local press, of course, about the arraignment today. And I want to read you some of those comments. I was able to jot down some notes quickly while he was talking. He said he did not watch the arraignment today. He was in meetings all day, but he certainly defended the former president, as he has been, even getting combative with the reporter who was pressing him specifically on those remarks he made right after January 6th, those remarks heard around the world, essentially, when he was on the floor, blaming the former president for his role, at least part of his role, in the January 6th riot, which McCarthy was certainly present for in this building and later had a phone call with Trump about. Just now, a few minutes ago, though, he defended the former president, saying he's entitled to question election results. He shouldn't be prosecuted for thought, he said. He then brought up Hillary Clinton not accepting the results of the 2016 election. Obviously, that was nearly a decade ago at this point, but he brought that up. He talked about the current findings into their investigation into Hunter Biden, the president's son. Of course, he's still weighing an impeachment inquiry into him. He brought it back to Biden every single time he was asked a question about this. He said on Biden impeachment that he won't use it for political purposes, unlike the Democrats, McCarthy said. He also questioned Attorney General Merrick Garland's timing in appointing special counsel Jack Smith. Remember, that happened November of last year, of 2020. 2022, a year and a half after the attack on the Capitol. There was some pressure even from Democrats on the January 6th Select Committee for the Department of Justice to do that sooner and open that investigation sooner. Brendan Boyle, a Democrat today, actually tweeting as well, thanking the January 6th Select Committee for doing all of that work and blasting Garland for that as well. So McCarthy was saying that Jack Smith, that Merrick Garland waited to do this until he said we saw that the former president's poll numbers were going up and he was the front runner of the Republican race. And he questioned the timing being so close to the 24 election. So a lot to unpack here from McCarthy. This is really the first member of Republican leadership in the House and Senate, aside from Elise Stefanik, the number 3, McCarthy's number 3, who of course has the ear of the former president. She talks to him often, she defends him often, but this is really the first commentary we've gotten. And Speaker McCarthy is certainly balancing, walking a very tightrope, as we've been talking about often, between those moderates and hard right of his party. But these comments certainly raising some eyebrows and some ears that he's making from California.
Julie Sirkin, live for us on the Hill. Julie, thank you, as you're taking a live look now at that motorcade heading back to Bedminster. Mark Murray, to you on Julie's reporting here. Your thoughts?
Yeah, some quick fact-checking, Hallie, as I was listening to Julie's reporting. And, when she ended up mentioning that Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, believes that about the timing of Jack Smith being appointed special counsel by Attorney General Merrick Garland. Do remember the entire purpose behind that special counsel was that it came after Donald Trump announced his presidential bid just a week after the midterm elections that had happened. So in November of 2022, Donald Trump already facing a lot of legal challenges and investigations. That is when the administration said, look, we need an extra buffer. We're appointing a special counsel here. So it's not Merrick Garland making all the decisions and the prosecution decisions. It is a special counsel doing the same thing. Another fact check when it comes to Kevin McCarthy and the reporting that Julie ended up having with that is that when he was saying, well, Hillary Clinton also questioned the election results of 2016, it's worth noting that Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, all were there for Donald Trump's inauguration. There was a peaceful transfer of power in 2016, despite what was, yes, that was a close election in 2016. Yet when we had another close election in 2020, there was no Donald Trump. The President of the United States decided not to be at that inauguration of Joe Biden. We, of course, with January 6th happening, did not have a peaceful transfer of power. And when you look at the entire indictment that we ended up having on Tuesday and the arraignment that occurred on Thursday, it all kind of goes back to that transfer of power. What was happening when Donald Trump ended up losing the presidential contest, all the schemes, all the maneuvering that ended up happening. And of course, the culmination of that was the indictment that we ended up getting Tuesday and the arraignment today.
Mark Murray, thank you. I want to go now to Washington to Aaron Gilchrist, who has been on the ground there in D.C. And Aaron, just to give a sense, I mean, listen, it is not often that we are taking live pictures from a chopper of a car driving down a highway, regardless of whether or not that car belongs to the former president. We have done this now for multiple indictments. It is a bit of a spectacle. It created one, at least at the Washington airport, where our team, our producer Frank Thorpe, got some pictures of people snapping photos from inside the airport of Donald Trump's plane, with the Capitol off in the distance. We have some photos we can pull up there. This is what Donald Trump, in many ways, and his team want to see. They want to see this become something where it is about the optics. He talks about that. He tries to capitalize on that through fundraising and through his comments. Talk to us about what it's been like on the ground there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there are a lot of people who recognize that this is today was a moment in history, something to be recorded and remembered. And so people came out in significant numbers trying to do that. I'm going to step out of the way here so you can see a little bit of what's left on the ground here outside the courthouse. A little bit of a police presence still at this point, still a very significant media presence on the street right in front of the courthouse. We also saw a lot of demonstrators, people who were here with signs and with flags, people supporting the former president, as well as people who held up signs that said, lock him up, folks who did not support or do not support the former president. At the same time, there were a lot of people here who didn't really seem to have a political angle that they were pursuing, but wanted to just see what was happening. There were people standing next to me across the street, looking down toward the parking garage of the courthouse here, who just wanted a glimpse of the former president as he came into the courthouse, as he left the courthouse. They had their phones up, taking pictures as well. Again, I think an effort for folks to be able to snap a memory from this moment in history, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they may be on. Hallie?
Aaron Gilchrist live for us there in Washington. Ken Delanian is back now from federal court. Ken, we are getting some new sketches in as well of former President Trump inside court. Reminder, no cameras there, so we are relying on the reporting from our team who was in the room at the time. Talk us through your key takeaways here. What are you looking for next as far as what's coming down the pipeline?
Well, there's clearly going to be a battle between the prosecutors and the defense lawyers about scheduling in this case. That was one of the great themes that emerged from this hearing. And by the way, I'll just say, having watched both the arraignment in Miami, Hallie, at the media overflow room there, and now today watching this one on video, the two events could not have been more starkly different in terms of atmospherics. Down in Miami, the magistrate judge was cracking jokes. It was a very loose atmosphere. He never asked Mr. Trump a question. Mr. Trump didn't utter a word. His lawyer entered the plea on his behalf. Today was much different. This magistrate judge was all business. It was a more intense, sober atmosphere. The courtroom was a smaller venue, so it felt more crowded. There was not a seat in the House. And Mr. Trump was addressed directly by the magistrate. Questioned. He had to give his name and his date of birth, and as she went over the charges and the penalties and the conditions of release, in treating him like any other defendant in criminal court, it was just a very sobering, kind of bracing thing, especially for me because I've covered cases in that courthouse and I've seen sort of regular criminal cases in those very same blonde wood paneled courtrooms, and to see the former president of the United States sitting at the defense table was remarkable. But in terms of what's next? So August 28th is the next hearing in this case before the actual judge, Tanya Chutkan, who asked both sides to essentially submit briefs about scheduling, when they think this case could go to trial. And Trump's lawyers, and particularly John Lauro, immediately started to push back on that, saying, he can't even really consider that until he knows the scope of the discovery in this case, the volume of documents the government is going to turn over. And the government immediately, the prosecution, pushed back on that and said, look, we are pressing for a speedy trial here. That is, in the interest of justice, and we're going to do that. And so, it's going to be up to the judge how quickly this thing can go to trial. But, it's very clear that Trump's strategy here is to delay, and Jack Smith's office wants to get this case to trial, Hallie.
Let me play now. Ken Delanian, thank you very much. The former president's son, Donald Trump Jr., is speaking about what has happened and today and the history that it is making. I want to play a quick bite from that.
This is the end result of liberals shouting and moaning about misinformation for years now. They want to ban speech they disagree with. And that's all this is.
He is not an attorney for his father, but he is certainly making a case that we could see his attorneys make, Danny.
Absolutely, and I think we need to be prepared for that kind of defense, to the extent you can get it into court. I mean, you can't go into court and say, I'm being railroaded. That doesn't always work. But if there is evidence of something like falsification of evidence or something like that, that, of course, can come into court. But Trump's attorneys are going to have to think really long and hard about how strategically they plan to crowbar in this defense, which is essentially we're being picked on. And to the extent they can argue that, look, this has happened in the past, this is going to be their argument. It's not my position, but they're going to argue that this has happened in the past. It happened in Hawaii in 1960, or it happened when Jamie Raskin stood up in the House and supposedly refused to recognize electors. Those are the kinds of things that the Trump team are going to want to get into court, but if they can't, get it out into the public consciousness, because that's the kind of thing that could help them with the jury pool, because you never know who's going to end up on a jury. And as much as D.C. is a very, you could argue, it's a blue city, but you just never know who you're going to get on that jury. And with good jury selection, you can really prune a jury like a bonsai tree with the right attorneys.
I'm looking here at some of these new sketches that we are just now getting in from the sketch artist Bill Hennessy in court today. And it brings me back to something we alluded to about 40 minutes ago, Danny. No cameras here.
Yeah.
No live stream, no audio.
Right.
Might that change for proceedings to come under Judge Chutkan?
If I were betting, I would doubt it. I mean, all roads, that final decision is Chief Justice Roberts. He is essentially the king of the judiciary, and so he makes decisions on that issue. In the last, starting in about, I believe, I think the pilot program ended in 2015, the federal courts began a pilot program to have some limited video only in civil cases. And when that pilot program ended, 3 judicial districts, including Guam, kept the program, kept video in certain civil courtrooms. The status of that program today is that program, the original pilot program, is over. But the point of that is that courts, federal courts, long considered a place where you would never see video, have actually opened up to the idea, and not just in the last couple of years. This goes back a decade ago that they were considering and allowing video cameras in the courtroom, albeit civil courtrooms, but it's a start.
And not video cameras like what we saw outside of court. It's not 600 members of the media cramming into a room. It's a single or maybe a couple of pool cameras that everybody then takes. It's not a, they limit the circus-like atmosphere.
Right. No, I remember from reading the report. I mean, if my memory serves me, one of the issues was they pointed out that during the program, a lot of people didn't take even that much interest in getting the video or obtaining it or watching. So, and you can understand that civil cases are generally not that exciting if they don't involve someone of note. They can be a little boring compared to criminal cases. So not a big surprise there, but these proceedings, you see the Supreme Court has now, not only do they release audio, I mean, you can find it on YouTube, and it's something that anybody, it's so democratic. You can go out there and listen to the Supreme Court say the abortion argument or the affirmative action argument. 3 hours right there. That's the kind of thing that as a law student, I would have been salivating over. And here we are. It's technology. It's the increasing expectation that our courts are open. And open doesn't just mean that you wait in line and sit on a bench in the courtroom. Open to the public is increasingly meaning we want to see it on our iPhones. We want to see it on our TV.
If it happens, you know you'll see it here, right on NBC News Now. Danny Savalos, our NBC News legal analyst. I want to thank Chuck Todd, Garrett Hake, Ken Delanian, Dasha Burns, Chuck Rosenberg, Mark Murray, the many, many people who have joined us over the course of the last hour and 40 minutes, and Tom Winter, of course, as well. It has been an extraordinary day in a summer that has been full of them, with the former president now arraigned after having been indicted 3 times in the past 4 months. He faces a total now of nearly 80 charges, and there may be more to come as we look ahead now to what could happen down in Fulton County, Georgia, where the district attorney there has said she will announce whether or not she plans to indict former President Trump by the end of the summer. Remember, Donald Trump now facing these federal charges of plotting to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election, the first time that a former president who is running to become president again has allegedly moved to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power that is a democratic norm, a core of our constitutional process. We will have much more coverage here on NBC News Now, as this, of course, has taken up most of the news oxygen today. There have been plenty of other headlines, though. We're going to get to them right after the break, including a difficult discovery near those controversial floating buoys in Texas. We'll take you live there to tell you what is happening next. Stay tuned right here on NBC News Now. Late tonight, Mexican officials say they have found now a second body in the river that separates Texas from Mexico, just about 3 miles away from the first body they found just 24 hours ago. All of it creating now more backlash over this issue of the human rights of migrants trying to cross into Texas. First body seen near these buoys we've been talking about, very controversial, a line of buoys. You see them in orange there on the right side of your screen. It goes on for about 1,000 feet. They're designed to prevent migrants from crossing the river into the United States. Texas Governor Greg Abbott had those put up. But it's a move that got a lot of heat from people on both sides of the border, with critics saying it could increase the risk of people drowning as they're trying to cross over. The Justice Department is even suing Texas over this. Governor Abbott's office is pushing back, saying both people drowned before getting even close to the barriers. Julia Ainsley is joining us now. And Julia, critics of these buoys are essentially pointing to this, saying this is the worst case scenario that is now coming true. Talk us through it.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. There's a big dispute tonight over whether or not the buoys are to blame for those 2 deaths. But before I tell you what each side is saying, I want to remind everyone of what the Biden administration cited when they sued Texas just last week over these border buoys. They said it wasn't just a matter of migrants drowning when they're trying to cross in that 1,000-foot area, but the fact that it's going to send migrants into parts of the river that might be more dangerous. So whether or not they drowned in the buoys, it still may be that the buoys are creating a danger. Now, here's what both sides are saying. We've heard from the government of Mexico, who said the government of Mexico reiterates that the installation of a wall of buoys violates our sovereignty and has an impact on security, integrity, and human rights of migrants. Mexico furious about this. They go on to say that this doesn't relate, that doesn't compute with their relationship with the United States. They're very upset with the state of Texas. State of Texas firing back. In fact, we heard from Abbott today saying that Mexico is flat out wrong. In a statement from a Texas spokesperson, they said, fortunately, the drownings in the Rio Grande by people attempting to cross illegally are all too common. This is a result of the reckless open border policies of President Biden and President Lopez Obrador, again, pointing to the Mexican president there. So a lot of shots fired over these 2 deaths tonight, Hallie, but as we know, these are 2 people who've perished in this dangerous water, and the border buoys are there creating a barrier to try to deter people from crossing there. And so this debate is only going to become more intensified after these 2 deaths.
Where does the back and forth with the Justice Department and this lawsuit stand tonight, Julia? Do we know?
Well, we know recently the Justice Department asked the judge to put a stay or an emergency injunction to get Texas to get those buoys out of there. So far, the judge has not granted that. But that case remains ongoing and could go all the way up to the Supreme Court, Hallie.
Julia Ainsley live for us there. Julie, thank you so much for that reporting. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a bus has fallen down a ravine in western Mexico, killing at least 17 people tonight. 20 others at least are hurt. Officials say part of the challenge here is that the terrain is really intense. Look at this. They've got to get down into this ravine. They've got to get back up the hill. They don't know yet what caused this crash. Number 2, the College Board says Florida has basically banned AP psychology. Why? Well, the class includes lessons on sex and gender. And Florida's Department of Education told superintendents that teaching those topics is illegal under state law, according to the College Board. It says this removes choice, in their words, from parents and students. Florida's Education Department and the governor's office have not immediately responded to requests for comments in a story that's getting a lot of attention today. Number 3, hundreds of people rallying today in Niger to support the military leaders who seized power and to protest against other countries getting involved. That's after the U.S. says it will pull some people out of its embassy there in what's being widely seen as an attempted coup. Number 4, the CDC voting today to recommend that all babies under 8 months get a new shot to protect against RSV. It is the first one that can protect infants against the virus. They're also recommending that some kids 8 to 19 months get a second dose. Keep in mind why RSV is so critical here. It's the biggest reason that kids under the age of 1 in this country end up in the hospital. Number 5, Tom Brady getting into a different kind of football. He's now a minority owner of the British soccer club Birmingham City. He says he's got some things to learn about English football. He sure does. But he says he knows a thing or two about winning. That is also true, to the chagrin of Eagles fans everywhere. The team says he's going to chair the advisory board, help out with stuff like health and nutrition, and presumably help them raise their profile, too, given his celebrity status. Coming up, a couple of Navy sailors are under arrest in new allegations we're learning about tonight. We'll tell you about them right after the break. Prosecutors in that suspected serial killing case out of Gilgo Beach, Long Island, now want the court to get a cheek swab from the suspected killer himself. They say they have to get more DNA to be able to better link the suspect to a key piece of evidence. We're talking about DNA found on the crust inside a pizza box. Look at it. You see it here. It's already matched the DNA of a hair found on burlap used to tie down and hold back one of the victims. The suspect here, Rex Heuermann, has pleaded not guilty to the murders of 3 women. He is also the prime suspect in the murder of a 4th woman, although he hasn't been charged in that one. I want to bring in Stephanie Goss now.
Hey there, Hallie. So DNA lies at the center of this case against Rex Heuermann, this alleged serial killer. According to the prosecution, they've been able to link, they say, hair DNA found at the crime scene with that pizza box that Rex Heuermann threw out. But now they want a cheek swab from Rex Heuermann, according to court documents. So they want something that will directly come from him, a direct connection. They even want to record him swabbing his cheek. And what this will allow them to do is to be able to say definitively that it is his DNA. And according to this court document, they write it would, quote, provide further relevant evidence of the defendant's identity as the perpetrator of the crime. Now, Heuermann pleaded not guilty to 3 murder counts. His attorney and he have the opportunity to fight against this request. We reached out to the attorney and he did not get back to us. Another really interesting part about this court document, which was filed on Tuesday, the day of that hearing, is that it says that Heuermann's wife, Asa Ellerup, her son and her daughter all provided DNA samples on the day that Rex Heuermann was arrested. Hallie?
Thanks to Stephanie Goss for that reporting. Federal officials tonight have arrested 2 Navy sailors for allegedly selling military secrets to China in a plot that we are just learning about. The price tag, apparently, thousands of dollars. Listen.
Mr. Zhao transmitted this information in exchange for payments that totaled approximately $15,000.
Wei sent national defense information to China, including documents, photos, videos, and technical manuals. In exchange, his intelligence officer paid Wei thousands of dollars.
Prosecutors say both these sailors passed along this sensitive info related to the technology they work with and about upcoming Navy operations to Chinese intel officers. Andrea Mitchell is joining us now. How long was this going on, Andrea?
Well, it's different for each of these cases. I mean, it seems as though these 2 men, and we don't have total clarity on this yet, Hallie, it seems as though they were not connected other than through the Chinese intelligence, which, of course, is a big connection. Zhao has apparently been doing this, Hallie, since August of 2021. Wei since February of 2022. And so far, we know that a hearing was held in L.A. for Zhao, who came from a base further up in Ventura County, but it was the federal court was in L.A., and he was arraigned, pleaded not guilty, and he's asked for that to be continued, for the detention hearing to be continued, so he'll still be held until August 8th, the next appearance. His trial is already set for September 26th. Talk about a speedy trial. I know what you've been covering all day and what we've all been watching as far as what's been happening in Washington. But in this very, very different case, of course, now we've got, we're still waiting at this hour to hear exactly what's happened in San Diego federal court. Again, an evening, California time, sometime after 5 o'clock our time. It just started. We don't even know that it's actually started in court. But in San Diego federal court is the second accused of espionage, Mr. Wei. And it's a very unusual case, of course, against a backdrop with increasing concern, as you know, about cyber espionage from China. Microsoft announced that China-backed hackers got into the unclassified emails of both the Commerce and State Departments, including Commerce Secretary Raimondo. Now, when we talk about unclassified, I've just been talking to security officials for the last couple of weeks about that case. And about 90% of the State Department's work is in the unclassified space. So a lot of information could have been gathered for quite some time by China. There's also been reporting from the New York Times about an even more concerning, deeper malware from China or China-backed sources. And Microsoft believes the Chinese government is involved. U.S. intelligence is working on that.
Andrea Mitchell, thank you so much for that reporting. Lots of other news happening today, and you are the tip of the spear for that. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching what has been several hours, of course, of our live coverage here on NBC News Now. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. I'm Hallie Jackson. It's good to be with you, as always. You can find us anytime, remember, in so many places. Peacock, Hulu, YouTube, and more. Just search Hallie Jackson Now wherever you like to stream or watch. We've got a lot more coming up with Top Story, picking up our coverage right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.